Hi everyone, and thanks for joining my channel, FM Marine Consulting. Today I want to help some of you who may be taking a very basic chart work course, perhaps for your small vessel operator proficiency or any other entry-level mariner ticket where you may be required to do some chart work and pilotage. There's some information on Canadian nautical charts in the title block that pertains to chart datum. That's what I want to talk to you about. Essentially, what we're trying to figure out is when we look at a chart and it tells us that there's perhaps, say, 15 meters of water at a given spot on the nautical chart, what does that mean? From what level of the tide is that number taken from? And that's basically what we're going to talk about, is chart datum. Okay, so I have a Canadian nautical chart of the Strait of Georgia. For the purpose of what we're trying to achieve here, it doesn't really matter. What matters is the information that you get from the title block, which is usually on the upper right-hand portion of the chart. So one of the first pieces of information in the title block below the obvious, which is the area that this paper chart is depicting, as well as the type of projection, is the fact that the depths are taken from a certain datum, and there's also a unit of measurement. Now in Canada, we use meters and decimals of meters, and it will tell you that clearly here. It will say depths are in meters and are reduced to chart datum. Now, what is chart datum? Okay, different charts from different countries, different areas of the world. It's a standard. However, the datum itself may slightly vary. Okay. So in order to explain datum and what is the zero of the tide, I've used this simple mason jar, which is meant to represent the depth of the ocean. Okay, so we got the water surface, say around here at the top, and here are some examples of various datums that could be utilized in hydrography. So for example, as we all know, the height of the tide differs based on the time of the year, the time of the month, proximity to the moon, proximity to the sun, etc., etc. And therefore, high tide is not always at the same elevation during the year, and same with low tide. Sometimes the tide is extremely low, sometimes the tide is extremely high, and most of the time there's some sort of an average in there where the average of the high tides for an area is differing very, very slightly, okay? So each one of those levels is being given a name. For example, an extreme high tide during large tides is known as higher high water of large tides, okay? And I put a line here, and what that simply means is that for a given area, the tide will seldomly ever get higher than that line. That is, if that line, say, if it's a 6-meter tide, okay, that means that it's very, very rare. It's hardly ever been recorded to be higher than that. Equally for the low tide, so the tide range between high tide and low tide, the lower low water of large tides would be a plane of reference that seldomly falls below that. Okay, so we need to determine, when we look at the paper chart and it says that the depth of water here, for example, is 24 meters, okay, which is called a sounding, at what point do we actually have 24 meters of water? Is it at high water of large tides when the water is this high, or is it during lower low water of large tides? Is it during mean sea level, MSL, which is an average of all of that, okay? And that's what datum is. It's simply a plane of reference by which we measure how much water is beneath that plane of reference. And so that information will be found in the title block at the top here. And for example, on this chart, it says that our depths are in meters and they are reduced to chart datum, which on this chart is lowest normal tide. So when the tide reaches what is referred to as lowest normal tide, we start to count how much water there is beneath that specific spot. Okay, so in other words, when we reach that plane of reference, we refer to this as the 0-meter tide. Okay, so when you pick up your application to look at what the height of the tide is at any given time of the day, for example, if it says in Vancouver today, high tide is going to be at 10 a.m. and the height of the tide is going to be 1.8 meters. What that simply means is that you have 1.8 meters above datum. And since the depths on the paper chart are reduced to datum, if I go back to my example of 24 meters of water at 0 tide, I would simply add 1.8 meters to that number to determine how much water I will have at 10 a.m. at that specific spot. Now, sometimes during the year, during new moon or in the winter, when we're in proximity to the sun in the northern hemisphere, we have excessively large tide ranges. So the difference between high tide and low tide. And sometimes when you read the tide books, it will give you a negative number. For example, the tide at 2 p.m. today is negative 0.2 meters. What that means is that the level of the tide that day will actually fall below datum by 0.2 meters. So if you had 24 meters of water at datum here, that means that when the height of the tide is negative 0.2, what you have is 23.8 meters of water at that spot. So you minus the number. Okay? If we have drying heights, for example, so in areas that are green on nautical charts, that means that those areas, they dry when we reach 0-meter tide. Okay, so that means that if you reach lowest normal tide that day, that beach is above the water, and the number, the sounding, will be underlined, meaning that there is, for example here, 2.1 meters above the water is the elevation of that beach when we reach 0-meter tide. So if you look at your tide book once again, and it says today low tide is at 2 p.m. and it's 0 meters, well, that specific area on the chart would be 2.1 meters above the water. It's called a drying height. And those soundings are recognizable on the chart because they are underlined. So for example, 2.1 meter with an underline, that means that this is a drying height. It dries above datum. Okay, but you need, for this to happen, you need to reach an elevation of the tide that is 0, which is lowest normal tide on this chart. So that is what datum is. There's various datums and different charts. Sometimes it's important to pay attention to the tidal block because they may use a slightly different datum than the one that you're used to have on your charts. And that's where you would find that information. So again, on this one, the depths are measured in meters and decimals of meters, which is the smaller number next to it in italic font. And it is reduced to 0 meter, which is the lowest normal tide, which is the plane of reference that is being utilized on this specific chart. That is the datum that we use. So this is the datum for depths, and there's also one for elevations, also noted in the tidal block. And again, it's the worst case scenario. We err on the cautionary sides of things. So if you want to know if you're going to fit your mast underneath a bridge or a power line, what they're going to give you is the clearance underneath that power line from the worst case scenario, which means when you would have the least amount of clearance, which of course would be the high water of large tides, which is a plane of reference that the elevation of the tide seldomly gets higher than that. So if you're here with your little sailboat and you got a mast and you want to know if you're going to fit underneath the bridge, the clearance provided on the paper chart is going to be the clearance available at the worst case scenario when the tide is at its largest ever recorded. Okay, so again, the datum for depths is a worst case scenario most of the time. On this chart, it's the lowest normal tide. And for clearances and elevations, it's above higher high water of large tides. If you would look at a land map, usually the elevations of mountain tops are taken from the mean sea level reference of measurement. So to say that a mountain is 800 meters high, it means that the peak of that mountain is 800 meters above mean sea level, which is a datum. I hope that helped to clarify what datum means and what is the zero of the tide, and that you can use that information to your advantage. Thanks for joining. Stay salty.